Hi, this is Tecora and welcome to the show. Tonight we've got a great show for you. We will be discussing HIV/AIDS in the Black community. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show right after this. Anthony, thank you so much for joining us. Tonight we have Anthony Sullivan, and Anthony is the Associate Pastor for Community Outreach and Development at God Can Ministries United Church of Christ. Thank you and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me this evening.
You know, when we talked about what we were going to discuss tonight, HIV/AIDS in the Black community, the first thing the first thing that came to mind was the fact that my sister died of AIDS, and it's not something that we talk a lot about in the Black community. I still don't know a whole lot about it, and I know that it exists. I know that our community is one that has a lot of HIV/AIDS in it. Yet people seem to be silent on this topic. So I'm really glad that you came on the show to kind of educate our community on what's happening with HIV/AIDS, not only in the community, but what kind of help they can get, where do they go to get tested, what is HIV/AIDS? Maybe we could start with that.
Certainly. HIV/AIDS stands for the Human Immunodeficiency Virus. Human meaning that only humans can get this. Immunodeficiency meaning that it is a disease that weakens the immune system. And then a virus meaning that it's a viral infection that actually would attack the blood cells within the body. So that's what HIV stands for. Mm-hmm. Acquired immune deficiency syndrome that's what AIDS stands for. And AIDS is a gradual process whereby the body just continually gets weakened, and it progresses from HIV to AIDS.
Okay. So how do people get it? I know the issue with my sister was that she was had been a drug addict since she was like 18, 19 years old. So I know that her lifestyle clearly was one that lent itself to this, and this was during the early part of when we first started hearing about AIDS. And so at that time, many thought that it was the gay man's disease. Mm-hmm. If you were gay, then you got AIDS, and if you got AIDS, you were gay.
Yes.
It just kind of went that way. Well, I know that my sister wasn't gay, but she still got AIDS. So let's kind of talk about how is this disease transmitted? How do we get it?
Certainly. HIV is something that has disproportionately affected the African American community since 1981. And there are primarily three transmission methods that one would contract HIV. The first method would be through sexual contact, whether that's anal or vaginal intercourse. That would be the first way. A second way that people would contract HIV is pretty much the way that your sister contracted it, which is through intravenous drug use, sharing unclean needles and things of that sort. And then the third way that we know that HIV is contracted is through what we call mother-to-child transmission, where the mother either passes the virus through her bloodstream to the child or in breastfeeding. Okay. And so those are primarily the three ways that HIV is transmitted.
Wow. So are you saying that the mother knows that she has HIV and transmits it, or can you have it and not know that you have it?
Well, that's a tricky question, but generally what we do primarily in this country is that when women are getting prenatal care. Quite often, their doctors will run a variety of tests on them in terms of all types of diseases. HIV being taking an HIV test being one way to look at it. The reality of it is that in many cases, some folks actually just don't get prenatal care. And so, because they don't get prenatal care, it may be missed. Also, there is a period of time when one has contracted HIV where the test, due to the sensitivity of the test, it may not necessarily pick it up right away. So it just altogether depends.
Boy, that's pretty scary.
Yeah, it is. It can be. The HIV test is a very sensitive test. But for instance, if you had unprotected sex last night and you decided to take an HIV test today, if you had actually contracted the disease in that time period, it would not show up in the test.
Okay.
It's not so sensitive that it would pick up that quickly.
Okay. So what is the incubation period for this disease? So if you have sex with someone, unprotected sex, and with someone who has HIV/AIDS, how long does it take generally for you to be diagnosed?
To be diagnosed. It varies because we're all different. Generally, what happens is if you have what we call, let's say you've been exposed through no fault, you've had sex with someone, and you determine that this person has HIV, and you go get tested. They would do an initial test on you, and then they would have you come back several months later to do some additional testing because there is an incubation period of time that would take place. It may not show up right away, and so I believe it would be, you would go in immediately, and then they would test you within, I believe, 3 to 6 months. And then they would test you again. And then sometimes, if the person is known to have HIV, the doctors may also do what they call post-exposure prophylaxis, which is where they may give you HIV medication to to possibly counter you contracting HIV.
Okay, but that's if you know that you have been with someone who possibly has it.
Yes.
Right? Okay.
Yes.
Now, you actually had mentioned 3 ways, I think, that you could get it. And it just came to mind the tennis player,
Arthur Ashe.
Arthur Ashe, because
Yes.
he didn't get it either of those 3 ways. I don't,
Yes.
Yeah.
Arthur Ashe got HIV through a blood transfusion.
Right.
And so, at least for, I would say, probably the last 25 years or so, the U.S. has screened blood, and so through the screening process, they eliminate that as a way of contracting HIV. So if people go give blood, any blood that comes through blood banks and things of that sort is actually screened for HIV.
Okay.
And so if people in the screening, they're determined to have had HIV, that blood is thrown out. It doesn't enter into the blood that is set aside for blood transfusions.
Now, you and I were talking earlier about an organization is it in South Africa?
Yes.
That where you were thinking about going to
Yes.
visit. Tell us a little bit about that place.
Certainly. I'm part of an organization called the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries. And through that affiliation, we have a AIDS orphanage in Africa called the Mother of Peace Orphanage. And that is run by a woman by the name of Mama Jean. And most of the children who live there, all of the children pretty much, have been either affected or impacted by HIV. And so we have a chapel there. It's a very self-sufficient place. There's a chapel, there's schools. They do their own cooking. They have a garden where they grow their own vegetables and things. They have a well and things of that sort. And so we have a mission trip that's coming up in late February, early March that I'm hopeful that I might be able to attend.
Okay. Are there things that we can do to avoid getting HIV/AIDS? I mean, what would you say? If you were, you have an audience now. Tell the audience what they need to do to protect themselves from getting this disease?
Certainly. I would say, first of all, that education is the most important thing that one could do. I have a father who's in his early 60s, and I have a daughter who's 16 years old. And so I engage in comprehensive sex education both with my 16-year-old daughter and with my 60-plus-year-old father, talking openly and honestly with them about HIV. I find that there are specific numbers that I use. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.5. Every 9.5 minutes, someone in this country contracts HIV.
Wow.
It is estimated that 1 in 16 African American men will contract HIV in their lifetime, and 1 in 32 African American women. Currently in this country, we have about, it is estimated, about 500,000 people who are living with HIV. Some of those people know it, others of them don't know it. So the first thing I would do is talk to people about getting educated about the disease. There's 3 ways primarily that the disease can be contracted. You can't get it off a toilet seat. You can't get it from kissing someone. So that's one thing I would like to say. The second thing I would like to say is that we have got to get tested. You will not know. You don't know if someone has HIV. So it's very important that one gets tested, that one goes and have a conversation about testing. I suggest that many of us go to our doctors once a year for an annual screening for things like high blood pressure or diabetes or different things of that sort. I advocate that when you go get those screenings that you also go get an HIV test. I think that's important as well. I think also it's about what I call espousing a love ethic, learning to love ourselves. Because, excuse me, if we love ourselves, we'll do everything that we can to protect ourselves. So we'll engage in healthy conversations, we'll engage in healthy dialogue, we'll get tested, we'll get the information, excuse me, and we'll do the things that we need to do to protect ourselves. And so those are things that I strongly advocate.
Okay. HIV, if you have HIV, does that mean that you have AIDS?
No. HIV would be the the starting point. Excuse me. It would be the starting point of the disease. HIV essentially is a virus. Essentially, what happens is that your immune system becomes compromised, and HIV progresses to AIDS. AIDS is a disease that takes place when there's a couple of markers that occur. One marker would be we have within our bodies, in order to have a healthy immune system, we have what we call T cells. And these T cells are fighter cells that fight off against infection. And so when a person has HIV, their T cell count lowers because it's compromised. And so when a person progresses to AIDS, it means either A, that their T cell count has decreased to less than 200, or that they are being affected by a list of different opportunistic infections. And these opportunistic infections are infections that would not normally take place in a person with a healthy immune system.
Okay, so it is quite possible that you can have HIV and not get AIDS. Will you ever get AIDS, or can you just have HIV and you know, it never goes to AIDS? Or?
It takes a long time for one to progress from HIV to AIDS. What we find in our community, however, is that we don't generally get tested. And so because we don't get tested, generally when we finally do get tested, we've already progressed many times from HIV to AIDS. And so what happens is, because of a plethora of different medications that we have that are available, we actually have the ability now where 30 years ago when we first began to talk about this disease, literally it was a death sentence. Now HIV really is a chronic disease that can be managed, and it's managed with medications. And so the medications may have some side effects and things of that sort, but we manage it better because of the medication.
Okay, so AIDS can be prevented, then, is what you're saying?
Well,
or
what I'm saying is that there's ways to slow that process down.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that it can be prevented, but there's ways that it can be slowed down.
Okay.
You know, many people at least 10 years ago or so, or even earlier than that, we were notified that Magic Johnson was diagnosed with HIV. And today, Magic Johnson still has HIV. He has not transitioned to AIDS.
I see. Okay. Okay.
And
So, what's happening in our community? What organizations are working to get the word out? I know that you're on the show because you're very passionate about this, but what other? Because I don't hear a lot about it, really.
well, there's a lot of work that is going on within the city of Chicago in terms of HIV/AIDS prevention and advocacy. A lot of work goes on through government structures. The City of Chicago Department of Public Health has a lot of different initiatives that they engage in terms of getting information out, doing condom distributions, having speakers come out and address groups. We also, within the City of Chicago, have the AIDS Foundation of Chicago. And this is an advocacy organization that provides all types of assistance from housing to testing. They do advocacy in terms of lobbying up at Springfield, lots of different work that they engage in. But then there's other organizations that do work. The NAACP, about a year and a half ago, or maybe 2 years ago, came out with a comprehensive plan in terms of how to fight HIV as a social justice issue. And so the local chapters of the NAACP, they have curriculum and they're doing lots of different work. Local churches and centers of faith, they are doing work. The churches that I work with within my denomination is Trinity United Church of Christ. They have a fantastic, phenomenal HIV/AIDS ministry where they link people to care, where they provide testing. Quarterly, the pastors at the church get tested from the pulpit. There's an organization on the South Side where South Side pastors and faith leaders, they have mobilized themselves together. Also, there's an organization on the west side of Chicago. Even the seminaries have gotten involved in this fight with regard to HIV/AIDS. McCormick does a yearly event around World AIDS Day, which is a HIV/AIDS program that they do with pastors and clergy and laity. The Seminary Consortium for Urban Pastoral Education. Just a few months ago, they had me come and do a workshop to address some of their constituents in one of their programs. So there's lots of work that is being done from even local centers of faith and churches to consortiums, to social justice organizations, to city organizations such as the Department of Public Health, and even then advocacy organizations like the AIDS Foundation of Chicago. There's lots of work being done.
So if someone is watching the show now and they want to find out more about it, what would they do first? What would be their next step?
Well, there's a couple of websites that one could go to. One of the websites that one could go to is AIDS.gov. It gives a lot of different information in terms of the affected populations, in terms of some of the special advocacy days that are held. It talks about a lot of the literature in terms of HIV 101. Lots of things there. There's another organization or another website that's called thebody.com that gives lots of information in terms of testimonies and stories, and again, lots of HIV 101 awareness information. The United Church of Christ, my denomination, we have our United Church of Christ HIV/AIDS network, where we tend to do a lot of training and technical advisement. We have a curriculum that's a faith-based curriculum that churches, if they're interested, they can go to our website, which is ucc.org. On the search button, type in "UCAN," and that information concerning our curriculum will come up. We have a curriculum called Affirming Persons and Saving Lives, and it's a comprehensive curriculum that is age appropriate from the age of pre-K to adults. And it really talks in good, concise, easy to understand information about what is HIV, what is AIDS, how do we prevent it, how do we take care of ourselves, what is our biblical mandate, what is our moral imperative. It's a wonderful curriculum.
You know, many churches, particularly like a fundamentalist church, do not even want to talk about sex outside of marriage.
Yes.
Much less AIDS. How do you address that with a church that, you know, says their mandate is you just don't have sex. That's how you can avoid it. You know, my personal opinion is that I think that we're losing sight of the fact that children are, women, men are having sex outside of marriage. We want to teach. I believe that it makes sense to teach abstinence, but I think that we also have to have some sort of education to go along with that. So how do you address that when you're talking about these kind of issues? How do you address that with people who, well, they just shouldn't be doing anything?
Oh, there's a couple of ways that I tend to engage in those conversations. The first thing that I would say is that everyone who has contracted HIV has not done so willingly. That is because they were out having sex outside of marriage. There are women and men who have contracted HIV being monogamous in their relationships and their partners were not. There are folks who have contracted HIV and AIDS because there was some non-voluntary sex act that took place. Whether a child was molested by an adult or someone, or a woman was raped, or a man was raped. And so I think if we're going to have a conversation, we need to understand that every time someone contracts HIV, it's not because of a consensual act or someone just engaged in some type of bad behavior. Some of us have contracted HIV literally because we did everything right. We were married, we saved ourselves till we got married, and then because we had a spouse who may have not known or may have known that they had HIV and didn't share it, they brought it to our marital bed, could have got off work late and were in a vacant lot or something, and someone accosted you. You know, there are brothers who sometimes who go away and they're incarcerated in the prison system, and all types of non-consensual sex takes place there. And so that's one way I would talk about it. And then the second way I would talk about it is that our churches and our centers of faith have a biblical and a moral mandate from God that we are to love one another, that we are to care for one another, that we are to reach out and spread out to the margins of society, and that we are to reach up and to uphold people. And so that we need, if that's what we're supposed to be doing, then we need to be doing it. That we need to be looking at people with eyes of compassion, that we should be engaging our communities in conversations that matter, because it doesn't matter. I think a lot of times in our churches we focus on how people got HIV, and not the fact that we should be focusing on how do we care for these people. And so I think if we shift the conversation and begin to have honest and open dialogue, and that we begin to practice a love ethic. Jesus loved everybody. Jesus did not condemn anybody. Jesus showed love to everyone. And so if we would focus on what Jesus did, I remember about 10 or 15 years ago, everyone was walking around with those little bracelets. What would Jesus do? If we would actually just begin to practice what Jesus did in terms of loving people, in terms of looking at people where they were and not condemning them for where they were, but loving them till they got to a place of healing and hope and wholeness.
So, what would you say to those who, and I hate to say I'm playing devil's advocate because I don't want to play with the devil at all. I really don't. But what would you say to those who still look at AIDS as the gay man's disease? And so, if you did not, because many still believe that being gay is a choice.
Yes.
You know, so. How do you address that with people? Well, if you weren't living in sin, you wouldn't have this problem.
Well, what I would share with people is that to look at the numbers. HIV, one of the rising demographics of people coming down with HIV in our African American community is African American women, and African American women are contracting HIV primarily through heterosexual sex. HIV has never been a gay men's or a gay white male's disease. From the onset in 1981, HIV has disproportionately affected black people. Black folks have always been disproportionately affected by this disease. That's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that if we look at the world, and not just the United States, but if we look at the world, look at this global landscape that we live in. HIV, the place that's most impacted by HIV in the world is Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And if HIV is decimating Africa, that's not because all of those people in Africa are gay. When we see the little shows that tug at your heart, when we're looking at Africa and we're seeing these different families, even the orphanage that I lifted up, those are orphans. Those children were conceived in heterosexual relationships, and they've lost mother and father to this disease. And so I think it requires that we shift our way of thinking. HIV has never been about gay men or men, period. It has been a disease, and diseases affect all people.
All people.
I
Yeah.
think the thing is that white gay men were able to mobilize themselves. When they saw themselves dying, they were able to look at their privilege as white men
Mm-hmm.
and say something has got to be done about this. And so that's why I think the story has been said or made to be about gay men or gay white men.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Before we, because we only have a couple of minutes left, I want to make sure that you talk about where people need to go to get tested, where can they call, who can they call.
Certainly. Within the city of Chicago, there's about 40 different places that one can get tested. If one would call 312-878-3810, that's a local number here in Chicago where they will link you up to places that you can get tested. I would also lift up that you can contact 800 CDC info, and that telephone number will hook you up to places within your local area if you're outside of Chicago, if you're in the suburbs or somewhere else where you can get testing information.
Mm-hmm. So now you're part of UCAN Ministries, United Church of Christ. If someone wanted, since people are watching you, if they wanted to talk to you about what we're talking about this evening, how can they reach you?
Certainly, I would. They could reach me. The best way to reach me is via email, and that would be at rev.anthony.sullivan@gmail.com.
Okay, all right. Well, Anthony, thank you so much. I really appreciate your coming on to the show. I think that this is a subject that is long overdue, a discussion that's long overdue for our community. And I would like to really encourage our church community to become more involved in the education of HIV/AIDS, because we have a captive audience on Sundays.
Yes, we do.
And on Sundays and every other day of the week for that matter. And so I think it's just really important that our churches step up to the plate and realize that our community is dying, they're suffering. And it's not just AIDS, there are many other issues that I believe that the church can be really involved, more involved in. And I didn't mention when the show first started that you and I were classmates. So that's how I met you. But we've had some really deep discussions, even in class, on
Yes.
how our church should become much more involved in the issues of the community. So thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me tonight.
And thank you for joining us. Have a good night.